Froehlich here, and she's going to wrap everything up, so no pressure. Thanks.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, everybody. I'm super excited to be here. I think Neil did an awesome job to really set up the kind of farm perspective of really diving in of offshore aquaculture. I'm not going to talk about offshore aquaculture at all. Well, that's not true. I have one picture, but that's it. What I'm going to do today is kind of set the stage, and this is hopefully going to be a full circle moment for you where I bring together aquaculture, fisheries, and the larger food system, because that's very much where I'm operating in. That's what I've been studying now for 4 years at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, or NCES, which is through UCSB. And the new initiative that we have through this institution is another acronym that you have to add to the list, which is CART, which is the Conservation Aquaculture Research Team that I helped found for our institution. Okay, but before we dive into this global perspective, I just want to give you a little context of that decade of schooling I mentioned, and how does a woman like me get into fish like this. So in 2007 to 2010, I went to the University of California, Davis, which has a pretty spectacular site for aquaculture. And I actually got my toes wet in aquaculture and wild fisheries by studying sturgeon. If you've never seen that, that's a sturgeon right there. Huge, massive fish. But I was part of the team that was responsible for successfully breeding an endangered species for the first time, green sturgeon, in captivity. So I started out in aquaculture, but it was freshwater, so I left. Went to the University of Washington School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences, where I spent 5 years studying invertebrate fisheries mostly. So I studied these little fellows right here, Dungeness crab, one of the biggest fisheries in Washington State. It actually now has surpassed in terms of actual profit and landings, surpassed salmon in Washington, which is crazy. These guys you can't farm, fun fact, because they're cannibals. So there's your takeaway for Dungeness. And then since 2015, I've been at the University of California, Santa Barbara as a postdoctoral scholar, where I've been studying large-scale considerations for marine aquaculture production in relationship to linkages to other food systems, and more importantly, a lot of my focus now is what does climate change mean for marine aquaculture into the future. So that gives you kind of a swath of how I got here. Now I'm going to give you kind of a guiding path of how I'm going to walk through this full circle description of aquaculture in our larger food space. So I'm first going to do that by talking about seafood status. So I'm going to talk about fisheries as well as aquaculture, because right now and for the foreseeable future, these two systems are inherently linked. And Neil kind of highlighted a few aspects, but God, you brought up the 2048 paper. You're killing me, the bane of my existence as a fisheries scientist. Fish are not going to collapse by 2048. We've leveled off a bit. But there are individual stocks that aren't doing so hot. But we're going to go through that, talk about seafood status. We're then going to kind of ground some of this consideration of where aquaculture fits in this larger global perspective, and look at it from that environmental and health perspective. So some of those stats that were being thrown out by Kim and Neil, I'm going to show you the data because I'm the scientist and I can't help myself. So I'm going to provide you with some context of the new research that's coming out. A lot of the things I'm going to be showing you have been published in last year. So this research is very much just coming online right now. And then we're going to talk about the dreaded seafood sustainability and all of its permutations. I'm going to keep it simple, but kind of what are the large considerations moving forward in the future. All right, so let's start at the top. And this is how I really like to start most of my large global seafood talks, is just to have the audience think about where do we get our seafood. And a lot of people think about it in different ways. Obviously, you guys have been taking these courses, so you have a better context and interest in where your seafood comes from. I think a lot of people, when I give talks, think about it this way. They have this kind of majestic imagery of a fisher casting a line during witching hour. I would definitely include myself in that a bit. I just spent a week in Idaho a couple weeks ago for a vacation. It was for fly fishing. It was the best vacation I've been on in a while. However, I think most of us in this room realize that the majority of seafood, at least wild capture, looks something like this. So this is a typical trawler that you might see, and just this imagery alone kind of gives you an idea, at least on the surface, the type of impact this has with all of these seabirds aggregating in association to get a free meal with the seafood being pulled up. And so this type of large-scale fisheries production has been ramping up since the 1800s. As Neil was saying, we've gotten really good at fishing. And now it's a very much a global impact. And so this research, as I've promised, published this year in 2018, this is the new and best approximation that we have for where the footprint, or at least where catches are coming out of the ocean currently. So the redder colors are higher in catches. So you see a lot of the fishing, wild fisheries happening. Southeast Asia, not really surprising. They're kind of at the hub at both aquaculture and fisheries now. But the other two regions that are really essential here are in the upwelling regions where there's lots of nutrients, so off the coast of Africa and South America. But you can kind of get a sense of the relative scale of what we're operating to extract out fisheries. And so what does that look like in terms of what we've been able to extract out? And that's been, as I've been saying, increasing over time. This starts at 1960. But we've kind of hit what a lot of people call peak fish. So while some of the stocks that Neil were talking about, Atlantic cod, have crashed, individual stocks have crashed, but overall, we've kind of hit a stagnation, or this threshold of fish that we're able to extract out over the last 30 years. It's basically been maintained at this global level of getting access, and here is Southeast Asia to give you a context down here of how much they're extracting. So, been relatively stable for the most part on average over the last 30 years. However, when you compare that to the population growth of humans, very different. We have this exponential growth rate. We are here at 7.6, that's the most recent estimate, 7.6 billion people. And I think this particular imagery I really liked because while it shows just the sheer exponential growth of people, it also gives us context about what's to come. So we have 2050, that's the future we're facing, but on this train is food systems, right? So this is important enough on this train of I think I can, I hope I can, important enough to be put on this graph. And something I like to propose to people, because they think, okay, 2050, that's not far, that's way far off, but how old will you be? Or your children will be. That's one generation. That's not that far off where we're gonna be reaching 10 billion people by 2050. I'll be 65, to give you some context. So I'll still be in academia slugging away at, hopefully I'll have tenure by then. But food systems, right? And seafood is part of that food system train. So while our population has been increasing, our fisheries have stagnated, so maybe our consumption hasn't changed over time. It has. We've doubled our seafood consumption globally. We're at around 20.3 now per capita over time, so that's not it. And for the importance of seafood, what I like to do is, okay, there's increasing people, we've been increasing consumption globally, but fundamentally, is seafood that important? I think the people in this room, we think it is. But let's give some numbers to how important that is, right? You already have your cheat sheet, so some of you might already know. But for those of you that haven't looked, I'm gonna give you a chance to guess. So we have maybe 1 million people, which that's a lot of people. 5 million? Maybe 3 billion, right? We're at 7.6 right now. So where are we at right now in terms of importance to protein? Yeah. So we're at 3 billion, and that's just for protein, right? That doesn't include kind of considerations of other livelihoods, supply chains, and all of the other things that could matter. But in terms of actual nutrition and protein consumption, greater than 20% of protein coming from seafood is about 3 billion people on this planet. But there's a lot of diversity in that. So here you're looking at, and if you're big global data nerds like I am, you should check out this website. It's amazing. It's this repository that has brought together just an extraordinary amount of data globally, food and otherwise, GDP, poverty indices, all sorts of stuff called Our World in Data. Their seafood consumption, you can go and explore that in different ways, shapes, and forms. But overall here, kind of the darker blue colors indicate really high levels of seafood consumption, but you can see there's kind of a spattering. If we look at something like the United States, we're a little above the global average in terms of consumption. It's pretty good, but obviously, if we compare ourselves to something like the Maldives, which are highly dependent on that, they're up in this kind of 200 kilogram. That rivals how much meat we consume. Does anybody know, on average, how much meat we consume in kilograms per capita? 144, compared to the 21.5 fish, just to give you some context. So, okay, we have increasing populations, stagnating fishing. Fishing causes mortality. And so that's a lot of pressure on our seafood. However, right, it's not operating in isolation. It's under this backdrop of climate change. And we're seeing more and more evidence coming in terms of those impacts on our fisheries of species on the move, disruption in productivity, contributing to, even if we put a moratorium on our fisheries, we're not seeing them bounce back. So we have things of changing temperature, lower dissolved oxygen or dead zones, and then harmful algal blooms, all combined kind of putting strain on those systems. So that kind of gives you a sense of what's going on in our fisheries. They're not totally in disarray. We're still stabilizing. We're still taking things out, but kind of capped out. So, right, how have we been able to continue eating? And that's why we're all here, thinking about aquaculture. And the thing is that we can look back to the theoretical or anthropological literature, anthropological and agricultural literature, and we're starting to see kind of similar trends playing out. As population or density increases, there appears to be a shift from hunting and gathering to farming. And we're seeing kind of the same things starting to play out now in fishing, which is the last of our hunting and gathering in commercial levels, with aquaculture, right? Farming. And so if we were to anticipate that, we would expect kind of things to level out or decline for fisheries and aquaculture to take off. Well, hot damn, that's what we see, right? This is since 1990, millions of tons. Aquaculture seafood, capture seafood, and aquaculture has surpassed capture seafood for the first time in 2014, and that's on the increase. It's now 53% of all our seafood. Okay, but again, all right, 3 billion people like it, blah, 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 but agriculture, right? How fundamentally does that stack up? I get that question a lot. In terms of seafood, how scalable is it? Can you actually profit by being a farmer? How big is this? And people don't usually have a context of where it fits into the bigger food space. So here we have our farmed estimate so far for seafood production. I already gave away where wild now sits. So what about something like beef? Where are we at? More, less, equal? Less? Okay, we got a less? A lot less?
This is world?
Yeah, this is global.
Oh, yeah.
So farmed aquaculture is more than beef. Actually, it surpassed beef before it surpassed wild capture fisheries, to give you a sense of that. So it's big, right? It's huge. And if you look at the trends in terms of beef increased production and farm fish over time, you get this nice kind of linear trend in beef since 1950, but this massive increase. Aquaculture has increased dramatically over such a short period of time, and kind of, to Neil's point, lamenting over the fact that, you know, in the 80s, there were a lot of wrongs done for shrimp and salmon farming. However, in a very short amount of time, they caught up to beef production. So just put that in some context, right? Beef's been around for thousands of years, and we've been honing that for a very long time, and we've been able to produce that much farm fish in a very short amount of time in comparison. However, bacon and chicken still reign king. People love their bacon, man. But overall, what we find is that seafood is really important, and that's continuously increasing with animal production. If we're just looking at that, 35% of that is from seafood. So it's a pretty substantial amount of contribution to our global markets. And when we're talking about aquaculture, so Neil did a great job talking about all the marine side, but most of it right now, right? Freshwater systems, approximately 40% marine. That's if you combine brackish and marine production. Inland freshwater aquaculture is the typical terminology. It can look like this, like raceways, but you can get kind of similar types of pen structures in lakes and ponds, as well as contained systems. The most common form of that, carp. Carp are produced like crazy, right? Southeast Asia, not only are they fishing like crazy, they're also producing like crazy. And then if we talk about the United States, catfish. Catfish is the #1 produced finfish here. Nearshore aquaculture, as Neil already discussed, this is kind of the mode of which we produce most of our marine-based aquaculture. However, most of it is not finfish production. In this environment, unlike freshwater environment, that's where mollusks reign. So things like oysters, the American cupped oyster is the #1 produced species here in the United States, but of course Atlantic salmon as well. And then, okay, here's my one slide to offshore aquaculture. I got you. And then we have offshore aquaculture. Will and Neil already talked about it, but you have species like sea bream and mussels as well. So that gives you the environmental context of diverse array of places to grow it, but also diverse array of species, seaweeds, mollusks, crustaceans, and finfish, as you know. However, the parts that I'm going to dive in a little deeper, if we're really going to talk about environmental impacts, is thinking about the linkages and how these species eat ultimately really lends itself nicely to think about those questions. So typically, there's always oddballs that stray away. So abalone, although mollusk does feed, but for the most part, unfed species tend to fall into the categories of mollusks, seaweeds. They extract, right, from the environment. And then you have the fed species that actually need to have direct input from the farmer. But overall, most recent estimate, we're at about 600 species that are either actively being raised at small or large quantities, mostly small quantities. And this is what it looks like in terms of the skewness of production. And this is specific to marine. So 60% of all production comes from China, circled there. And then the world is, the rest of the world is doing their thing. 90% is produced in Southeast Asia. Here for marine aquaculture, you kind of see the two sites of where you see salmon production up in Norway and Chile. Okay, so that gives you kind of some fundamental idea of where we are sitting in that global context, tying in kind of where offshore aquaculture kind of fits into this larger global landscape of how big aquaculture is. Now let's dive into looking at some of these patterns and linkages that I was talking about that really kind of sets the stage for understanding environmental considerations as aquaculture continues to expand, potentially doubling by 2050. So aquaculture is growing rapidly. I already told you that. What I didn't tell you, it's the fastest growing food sector in the world. So that's pretty incredible. And I told you that it surpassed capture seafood, but I didn't tell you that it also has a trajectory to surpass all capture. So, and there's a very fundamental distinction between those two things. And most of the time, they ended up getting mushed together and get conflated, but ultimately this is really important in terms of sustainability for aquaculture, which is alluded to in the previous talk a bit. But note, this surpass of all capture, before I describe it, is about to happen in the next couple of years, right? Here we are at 2018. It's not far off. So let's dive into this bit if we're talking about all capture. So that extra 20 million metric tons, those are those little suckers, forage fish, that Neil had mentioned in the beginning. Things like Peruvian anchoveta, Pacific herring, chub mackerel, Atlantic menhaden. These are kind of the big ones when we're talking about landing these things. These guys are amazing in terms of their ability to produce biomass in the world. The way that we tend to eat them, however, is not directly. The majority of forage fish end up going into feed. And we've been doing this for a very long time. Records right now, at least decent data, go back to the 1960s. We've been feeding these guys to pigs and chickens since the 1960s. And what has changed is not necessarily the fact of using these guys for feed, but it's the user group has shifted. So it wasn't until the 2000s that aquaculture was big enough where it actually came online as the dominant user group. So right now, best estimates, aquaculture uses about 75% of forage fish that we land, that 20 million. And then the other remaining 25 goes to pigs and chickens. So just to give you a sense of what the hulls look like for forage fish, this is an example of a hull for a type of species. Very effective. There's low input and high output for this. You don't have to spend a lot of gas to go find these things because they're schooling species. So as I mentioned, about a third of all landings, it's $1 billion industry. It's a huge industry. And the reason most of the time it goes into feed is that these two things kind of fundamentally drive a lot of it. Expensive to process, they're tiny boned. And so to actually fillet these types of things and put it in a form that people like to eat is inherently expensive, labor intensive, and a lot of it is that people don't prefer to eat them. So there was a large movement that was pushed in Chile, which is where the Peruvian anchoveta is landed. And man, the NGOs tried really hard to get people to eat anchovies, and they just wouldn't. They didn't want to eat them. So that kind of has been released a bit, but there's still a lot of people that consider the option for this, and it certainly is, but for right now, aquaculture is the dominant user group. But it's not just linkages to fisheries that aquaculture has. It's other food systems like agriculture. So in addition to feeding our fish, which is pretty normal, remember back that trajectory of aquaculture increasing and fisheries remaining flat. So we can't just feed fish to fish because we don't have enough fish to feed to fish. Is that too many fish? Okay. So we've had to get very good at looking at other alternative feeds. And for the most part, crops tend to be the least expensive and usable and accessible to do that. So things like wheat, soy, and corn have been additives, which are also additives in all of these fellows right here as well. So if we have these linkages then to forage fish in the marine environment, to agriculture on the land, that means that there's some dependency there. And that's where a lot of my research kind of has been focused on for the last few years. And it's the question about what does this expansion then mean for environment and human health, right? And we can't look at it in a silo. These systems are inherently connected. This is just one way, or at least a couple ways that I'm showing you, but there's a suite of others that we're exploring with my team at NCs. And the reason why, for, say, forage fish, we care about them is very much from a marine perspective. And while I haven't done and run the calculations for the conversions for wild species, not just things that we harvest end up eating forage fish, they can be this kind of linchpin in marine ecosystems where we have this middle ground of converting energy from plankton up into higher trophic levels of things that we inherently care about, whether we harvest them or not. So whales and sharks, for instance. So, and I've actually spent a fair bit of my time at UW where I studied forage fish. So Pacific herring was one of my study species that I focus on. So I was on the flip side of considering how do we manage and monitor these species that are being consumed. So it's a full circle moment for me studying aquaculture and forage fish. And this actually led to a paper in a collaboration with my forage fish counterparts up at the University of Washington. So I convinced a whole bunch of fisheries scientists that we should study aquaculture and look at the different ways we can think about not reaching the upper limits of forage fish into the future. I'm not going to show you all of the math. I'm going to keep it relatively down to the basics of the findings that we did, but we did a lot of fitting and data-limited models and tracking down of data. And what we found for this question is that yes, some good news, which is very rare in my field, you can avoid the upper ecological limits of forage fish with combined actions. And kind of the three that we found that appeared pretty achievable of trajectories that we're kind of already seeing now in the industry passively a bit, but that could go a lot further. One of them, stop putting into forage fish into non-carnivorous species. So as I mentioned before, carp, massive production of carp. And they didn't used to eat forage fish, but they do now because it increases their growth. They can grow anywhere 2 to 5 times faster when you feed these guys forage fish. The same reason we fed them to pigs and chickens. They have better condition factors, they grow better, because these little crunchy guys are filled with everything you need, and nature makes it for you. However, if we just reduce it, not completely eliminate, and we only reduced input by 4%. Like, you don't have to reduce it a lot into the future to get high returns. Eliminate it from pigs and chickens. That's already kind of happening because of the price. So market is kind of doing this for us already. And the last one, the elephant in the room, China really is going to have to step up. So China adopting greater inclusion alternative feeds, and whether that's crop-based or algae or seaweed, pick your favorite. If they adopt a higher, greater adoption of any of those things, trimmings from fisheries or aquaculture at about 30, 35%, these things combined can mitigate reaching the upper limit and stay at where we are right now. So this is good news, everybody. Good. There's stuff happening in that realm. The data to actually validate that is another issue. Yeah, exactly. But most of the effort, for the most part, has been focused on fisheries reform, to be quite honest. But a lot of this can be embedded within interfacing with the feed companies. And so that's part of the kind of strategy of maybe there's a chance of not just having the top down of the government doing it, but if the feed industries make a concerted effort or the farmers themselves, that becomes inherently complicated. Yeah, exactly. So the former two are probably a little more impactful if you do it that way. But people are really invested in it for a number of reasons I haven't even gone to. Okay, so connections, feed, all of these things. So again, land use is a major one in terms of how we use crops for producing the things we like to consume. So this is a paper, again, just published this year. It's the most comprehensive meta-analysis that has been done of over 40,000 farms around the world. It was a really extraordinary effort that was done by a PhD student for fun over a 6-year time period. Like, what are you guys doing? I don't know. So when you look at this is the median land use per meter cube for 100 grams of protein production. Kind of take-home message here, beef is a lot, aquaculture is not, right? So there's a suite of kind of diminishing impact when it becomes land use when you look at these interfaces. Greenhouse gas emissions, somewhat similar trends, right? Ruminants don't do very well in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and they slowly kind of decline as you go down the line. Shrimp have a little higher just because of the microbes that sit in ponds and can result in higher greenhouse gas emissions. And this is all related to what was brought up previously, feed conversion ratios. So as promised, I'm going to show you graphs. Pound of feed in for pound of feed out, and there's a lot of variability. And that is inherently efficiencies, where you are located, what type of conditions and feed you're putting these species. And so if we look at something like a cow, minimum right now range, and this is if you're in the United States, 6 pounds of feed to get out 1 pound of beef, which is still extraordinarily high input, but it can be well past 30 in other regions. But you look at something like aquaculture, as Neil noted, some companies are reporting conversion factors as low as 1 to 1. So that ultimately just is really somewhat simple math. Low inputs can mean low impact. Yeah?
Well, I have a question about that reporting, because they're growing food in the pens, right? But then they have them out in wild environments.
bit, yeah.
Microbial, plankton stuff.
Sure, yeah. But in terms of the things that they're actually consuming to put on weight, and actively not having to forage for anything, results in these kind of lower values. So it's not by happenstance that farmers are able to get these numbers low. And the timing and when you actually feed has a huge part of that. So while they may be able to snack on little critters that swim through, it's not the majority of what they would be feeding on. And then let's see if it works. Don't forget all the unfed species. So these guys don't necessarily require feed, right? They can filter their environment, providing ecosystem services, and you can actually see it in real time. So Pacific oyster, for example, can filter water anywhere between 20 to 50 gallons in a 24-hour period. In terms of providing that, it's pretty extraordinary. So you can put it in regions that are eutrophic. Obviously, there's some hesitation then of considering, well, I don't want to consume this type of dirty muck. That's just for demonstration. The kind of point here is that you wouldn't obviously put it into a highly polluted area and try to feed it to people. But the kind of theory behind this is that if there's high nutrient runoff, say from agriculture or something, these types of production or regenerative aquaculture could be really beneficial. Okay, so we have these linkages, and we have our current food production system, and we have an understanding for right now, more so for agriculture and fishing, of use of space. And so all these interconnections and these higher feed conversion ratios in land-based production, especially for ruminants, resulted in maps like these, where 40% of all arable land is used for agriculture, for crops and pasture across the world. Just for livestock alone, it's about 4 billion hectares, which is a lot. And this actually prompted our work that Neil had mentioned, which is thinking about, well, what's the potential for aquaculture around the world? So this is not an actual map of where aquaculture is. We don't have that. We actually don't know where aquaculture is around the world. And we're working on it. We have a lot of satellites nowadays. There's a lot of big data to help out with that. But it's still somewhat of a trying to aggregate data together. We have some point estimates, and in regions like Norway, we have a pretty good idea, but This map, however, there's a lot of math and assumptions underlying it, but what we wanted to do was use some fundamental ecological theory about fish growth that we can then apply to limits, like don't put it in MPAs. Okay. Avoid really high traffic shipping lanes. Get rid of that. Limit it to 200 meters. So, put some cost proxy on that. Get rid of oil rigs, right? All of these are debatable, but we wanted to say, well, what if we were black and white and just said no? And we didn't have any of that space available for aquaculture. What are we left? And do we have highly suitable areas for that growth? And this is for finfish production, and we find that about 3% of the ocean is super suitable, even when we're really steadfast on those decision-making components. And while that's a lot of space, and by no means are the co-authors advocating for this development whatsoever, and that was kind of the level that Neil was talking about. Instead, the cool part of this study is that we don't need all that area to produce a lot of food. So we kind of dove in, and we wanted to get a sense of, well, what if we wanted to produce something equivalent to what fisheries produces right now? How much area would that fundamentally take? So we did that. Turns out about 0.015% of that 3%, so not of the entire ocean, of that 3%, could produce about 100 million metric tons, right? Here we are, Southern California. When you add and aggregate that percentage, it's the size of Lake Michigan in terms of the amount of surface area that would take to produce that amount of food. And that's greater than all capture fisheries combined. You then compare that to fisheries, because we do have this now. This is new. Another recently published, this was paper, or at least this is the data from 2016, but a paper published this year and last year, looking at the overall, quote unquote, footprint of fishing. And this is from Global Fishing Watch. higher the color or darker the color, the higher the impact. Right now, the estimates for fishing footprint direct for like actual lines and transects, about 4% of the ocean. Some estimates of people considering ecosystem impact, so kind of those seabird effects that I was showing you at the beginning, that would constitute about 55% of the ocean is influenced by fishing. There's a heavy debate around this. You can follow it on Twitter feeds of fisheries scientists. It's a hot topic, guys, I'm telling you. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the relative environmental or low environmental impact that you can have. Diet shifts with seafood also are really beneficial. So this was a study, not 2018, 2014, okay, I cheated. But it looked across different dietary results from a meta-analysis to look at the overall reduction in relative risk percentage. So the bigger the bar, the better. And looked at Mediterranean, pescatarian, and vegetarian diets across type 2 diabetes, cancer, coronary mortality, and all causes of mortality. I labeled the fish for you, so it was really easy to identify which ones have more fish. And by and large, fish does a really good job, sometimes even better than vegetarian diets when we consider all mortality. And importantly, we're able to look at differences in the actual quality of the fish. A study that was done in Washington State looked across the kind of different toxins that could be potentially in salmon, since it's one of the biggest things that we consume, and there really is no distinguishable level. They're all low for both these species. All right, so all of this is amazing, and aquaculture is pretty extraordinary. Fish are awesome. We can all agree. But what about sustainability? Great. How do we scale seafood sustainability? And people have dedicated their entire lives to try to even just define sustainability, so I will spare you. The simple kind of connection is that it's complicated because not only are we now accounting for ecology, right, the environment of sustainability, we're now accounting for the social dimensions, slavery, human abuses. That's now becoming an important facet of how we produce our food, and seafood is part of that. And that includes aquaculture because not all aquaculture is created equal, just like fishing, right? Not all fishing is created equal. So if we can focus on the good actors, focus on best management practices, let's do that. However, it gets really complicated. It can be extraordinarily challenging because of this. Does anybody know what this is? Trade, yeah. Seafood is the most traded food commodity in the world. If you were to combine things like corn, coffee, and cotton combined, seafood is still more. So in terms of trying to trace this stuff, it's really hard, and that is at one of the hearts of sustainability and trying to understand it, because it's hard to know where our seafood is coming from, especially in the United States. Organizations are trying to do it. You have a suite of organizations trying to classify and aggregate sustainability. These are some of them. It can provide more complexity than answers sometimes, but it's a good metric, and it's the best we have so far, and it's ever improving. So the theory of change for sustainability is this ever progressing thing. It's not stagnant, so we won't just one day figure it out. It's going to be an ever evolving attribute within the seafood sector. And of course, unfortunately, I have to rain on your parade. Climate change, not only is it impacting fisheries, it's going to impact aquaculture too. So while aquaculture is amazing and can do a lot of things, there are limits, and there's a lot of unanswered questions. This is a study and a lot of work that I'm focused on now is looking at where the impact's going to be. And where is it going to be most heavily felt over time? So this is finfish production. Blues are bad. It's decrease in potential production over time over the next century. And we're anticipating to see stuff impacting the region, which I've noted in the beginning is where all the aquaculture is. So there's a lot of need for new research and understanding and consideration of where we produce our food, because there's a lot of good areas for finfish productions that show increase in potential. So that can be overwhelming. I like to end on a slide of well, what can you do as a person, as an individual, as a consumer? Number one, vote. I know it's past midterms, okay, fine. But vote for people that have your best interests, that want to push forward initiatives that you're invested in. So do your homework, know who your representatives are and what they stand for, whether that's for seafood and trade and transparency and or climate change. That's part of it. Simply ask where your seafood is from. Even if you don't know, the fact that you push some pressure on restaurants at grocers sends a signal. And then number three, look for local in labels. So while this dramatically oversimplifies the sustainability, it provides some kind of basic things that you can take away to think about your seafood. So in the end, seafood is a critical part of current and growing food security. Fisheries is still important. While my title says the future is farmed, fisheries for the foreseeable future will still be part of the equation, but aquaculture is now the dominant form. And seafood production can be a lower impact on the environment as well as have health impacts, or health benefits, excuse me, and sustainability is ever evolving. And so with that, I'll take your questions. And love sucker, guys.